So the work of a philosopher of art, like the work of philosophers in general, is to scrutinize and try to get into shape the concepts that we need to carry forward the practices of art we're engaged in, whether we're artists or critics or just art lovers.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Noël Carroll. He is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and his work has focused on the philosophy of aesthetics, art, film, and a range of topics. His books include, among several others, Minerva's Night Out, Philosophy, Pop Culture, and Moving Pictures, Art in Three Dimensions, Living in an Art World, On Criticism, Thinking in Action, Beyond Aesthetics, Philosophical Essays, and a very short introduction to humor. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Carroll.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Sweet. So I did want to talk about some of your views that you've put forth and defended in the philosophy of aesthetics, and one that I came across in at least a couple of your works is a view called moderate moralism, and I take it, roughly speaking, that this is the view according to which sometimes a moral defect in some artwork, be it like architectural art or a painting or a film or something else, that moral defect will count as an artistic defect. And the basic idea I take is that at least sometimes it is part of the design of some artwork to engender some response. And if it suffers some moral defect such that it does not do so, right, that moral defect leads to that failure to produce that response, then it is defective, artistic quality. Do I have the basic idea right? And can you talk briefly about your view here and some of the alternatives?
Sure. Maybe, yes, you do have the idea right. Maybe I could help by putting it in a context which might illuminate why it makes a difference. Probably all of your audience have heard or gotten involved in an argument at one time or another where a work of art is charged with immorality, and the response is, wait a minute, that's not anything to do with art. Art is its own realm, and moral claims are not really germane here. As Oscar Wilde famously said, books are not good or bad, they're well written or not. This also was the strategy that a number of art historians took when Robert Mapplethorpe's photographs were attacked. They tried to say, "Oh no, these works are about formal values. Look at the composition." So there is a view that art is somehow exempt from moral, political, cognitive, etc. questioning. You could call this view autonomism. That art is autonomous. It's a separate realm, marked off from other realms. Now, autonomism comes in two different shapes, at least. One you could call the high octane version of autonomism, says that it never is correct to raise moral questions with respect to any work of art. That seems too strong a view. It certainly doesn't accord with the history of art, where For example, so many works of art historically are connected with the presentation of religious ideas, including ethical ones. So radical autonomism, the kind, say, that Oscar Wilde defended, seems far too radical, and really doesn't get out of the gate. There don't seem to be too many defenders of it. Uh, However, there's a fallback position that the autonomists can take, and we'll call it moderate autonomism, and that's the view that says something like this. Yes, a lot of works of art are involved in presenting, for example, moral viewpoints. That's historically undeniable. However, and you can evaluate them for that reason. You can say, the Marcus de Sade's 120 Nights of Sodom is immoral. You can issue moral judgments. However, those moral judgments are never really uh, aesthetic judgments. They're separate. So you can make moral judgments, but they're to be understood as separate from aesthetic judgments. And this is where the rubber hits the road. And a moral defect in a work is never an aesthetic defect. Okay, so this is where moderate moralism enters, gets on, comes onto the stage, because it's going to deny moderate autonomism. And the way I go about it was kind of the way that you described, or this is one line of attack. Um, Works are very often designed to evoke certain emotional states. For example, mystery stories are designed to evoke curiosity. If they're designed in such a way that they don't evoke curiosity, they're aesthetic failures. They're failures as works of art, as the kind of work of art they are. So if you open a mystery and in the first page you say, "Oh, I think the butler did it," and the second page you think, "Oh, the butler did it," and all the way till the end, and then finally it's revealed that the butler did it. And this is not some postmodernist meta narrative. It's a failed mystery. Then you count the fact that it was not able to elicit the effective response of curiosity as an artistic failure. Now, moderate moralism, as you sketched it accurately, says, look, sometimes a work may fail because uh, uh, it calls for a moral emotional response, but though it calls for that, it can't deliver it for one reason or another. Now, just take an extreme example. Suppose you're reading a novel in which an alien race is portrayed, and in that alien race, they believe that uh, eating innocent babies is morally okay. And you, as a reader, or if it's a movie, you as a viewer, uh, you can't get your mind or your heart into that. That presupposition is just one that you can't accept. Some philosophers call this imaginative resistance. So you're asked to feel something and you can't feel it. Why can't you feel it? Well, because it's morally defective. Emotional states of various sorts require that you mobilize a certain kind of moral response. If a story is designed in such a way that you're unable to muster that emotional response, because it requires a certain kind of moral sensitivity that the work fails to support, that's an artistic error. You could think of it as a design error. And now think of characters. Characters in fictions are designed in certain ways to elicit certain kinds of responses. So it would be probably a design failure. That is, you've got the wrong character to get the response that you want if you were trying to make the tragedy of Adolf Hitler as we know him. It couldn't be, his death couldn't be a tragedy. We wouldn't be able to get our moral hearts and minds around it. Why? Well, because he got his just desserts. So that's the idea of moderate moralism. It's moderate because it doesn't say it's always, that a moral defect is always an artistic defect, but that sometimes it can be.
Yeah, very good. It's a great overview. I was just thinking, it seems right to me. I was wondering, thinking of ways that people might respond to that. One thing I was thinking is, are we making whether it has the defect sort of audience dependent, right? Because you could imagine that alien artwork would be effective with respect to the alien audience, but not with respect to us with different moral proclivities. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do, and that's a fair observation. Maybe in fact, a group of Nazis in Brazil have a private screening of the tragedy of Adolf Hitler, and they're all weeping at the end of it. That means that what I have to do is idealize to a certain extent the audience I have in mind. And the way I try and idealize the audience is to talk about people of normal moral sensibilities, not not for example, I wouldn't suggest that the audience that we should be considering when we think about a racist jokes or officers of the Ku Klux Klan. The audience that we have to think about is what we think of as a morally sensitive audience, and that involves a kind of idealized positive.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Actually,
And
sometimes
yeah,
people criticize that because they say, "Aha, there are an awful lot of works that a moderately sensitive audience might miss." And at that point, I want to make a distinction and say, "Look, I didn't say that it's a perfect." Perfectly moral audience. It is the case that artworks, novels, stories, films can be pretty complex. They can be so complex that you could actually miss something. In the recent, very popular stage show and movie, Hamilton, there's a point at which Thomas Jefferson treats his mistress Sally Hemings as a servant, but you can hardly notice it because so much is going on at the same time. So it's not as if we have these audiences who are perfect in their attunement. Uh, uh, they can miss something. And that's, again, why this position is moderate moralism. There could be a moral defect in the work that goes undetected for all kinds of reasons, including the complexity of the work.
Yeah, that's a fair point too. I guess it can quickly get complicated. Maybe giving a appropriate analysis here, but broad strokes, it seems the approach seems right to me.
Well,
Um,
I have to say it's um, uh, as maybe you and your listeners who are familiar with philosophical logic knows, some means at least one.
hmm,
So
right.
modern moralism can sneak through on that logical peculiarity.
Yeah, so long as you have one, then it's true. The autonomism of either sort is false. Um, right.
I think we could
And
get more than one, but
right.
realize that um, uh, in this particular tennis game, uh, I
You
have
set the
the
bar kind of low. Yeah, I mean that's a sometimes offers a dialectical advantage, I guess. um, so I did also want to talk about the philosophy of horror, which you've written about, and
sure.
um, one of the key issues in the philosophy of horror is what's been known as the paradox of horror. And so, roughly speaking, the problem seems to be that on one hand, horror is meant to be fearsome, grotesque, aversive, but on the other hand, people seek it out. They at least sometimes um, watch it and don't regret having done so. Um, and I take it that your broad approach is to say that horror satisfies some other interest, like some fascination, and on balance, sometimes the grotesque and fearsome nature of the media, we find that worth bearing. Is that right, or how would you describe your approach here?
Yeah, yes. I mean, there are a number of ways of trying to dissolve this paradox. One would one line is to say uh, it's not really a paradox at all, because things that are fearsome and disgusting are not necessarily always aversive. Um, the other is, and there is a way to make that reasonable. After all, with many of the emotions that fictions, movie fictions, other kinds of fictions elicit. Um, After all, we are able to undergo the emotions because we don't have to usually pay the cost that the emotions involve. So people would say, well, I like to have a good cry tonight, right? And so they decide they're going to watch a melodrama, and they have a good cry. But notice that in this case, they don't actually have to pay the price you usually have to pay for sadness. Sadness, by definition, involves loss. Um, the character may have lost her son, but you haven't lost your son. Similarly, the character is terrified being uh, chased by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but you're not being chased by a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So you have the jolt of fear, but you don't have to pay the cost. Just like in a roller coaster ride, you're able to experience the fear of falling, but you're not really falling. So that's one view, is to say, yeah, these emotions are worth entertaining, uh, 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 as long as you don't have to pay the price. Uh, uh, the view that I have tended towards is slightly a different one, and that is that um, very often, the view that I'm proposing is connected to my definition of horror, which not only involves fear, but fear and disgust, fear and disgust together. And though fear might be something, the emotion of fear might be something that we would enjoy and entertaining if we don't have to pay the cost. Disgust is a little harder to talk about. I mean, if something's disgusting, if you're gagging, for example, that's not such a great feeling. That isn't like fear, because disgust in its way has a cost all of its own. So if you feel like you're going to throw up while you're watching The Exorcist, that's not like an emotional or a physical state that you're going to enjoy being in. So I think that because of the special role that disgust plays in horror, that it's not so easy to say, oh, well, you don't have to pay the price. So what I suggest is, well, actually, you're willing to pay the price because you get something else. There's a trade-off. And the trade-off is, well, this involves certain presuppositions about what is involved in disgust. One thing that's involved in disgust, and here I follow the anthropologist Mary Douglas, is some kind of some kind of violation or jamming of our normal categories. So, for example, the creatures in horror are categorical violations. What do I mean by that? Well, they're living and they're dead at the same time, right? Think of the very popular television program, The Walking Dead. These things, these zombies are strange combinations of living and death.
Frankenstein.
Pardon me?
Or Frankenstein, some
Oh,
sort of thing.
Frankenstein is a perfect example of living and dead. Yes, exactly. And there are more of them out there. Mummies that come back, right? In any case, though, what's disgusting about these creatures, though, is also something that can be fascinating. And that's what I think is the solution to the paradox, that we're willing to take the pain as the price for the possibility of fascination. Now, anybody who's gone to a lot of horror films and even read a lot of horror novels know that we're talking about the promise. They don't all pay, right? In fact, some of them fail quite disastrously, and maybe even a lot of them do. So what I'm trying to explain is why one would um, put one's money down to either buy the novel or go to see the film or to watch the television program. It's the promise of fascination. It's not that they're all fascinated. Some, in fact, are ridiculous. Maybe many. One of my favorites is a film I saw as a kid called Robot Monster, which is about a monster that came from outer space. It was very cheaply made. They had a gorilla suit, so the man wore a gorilla suit and then had a diving helmet on for his head. Not fascinating at all. Actually laughable. And even as like a 12-year-old, we all knew that it was kind of ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, I think yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I was also wondering, um, like, what is it that would make some horror better than another? So, like, with this kind of picture of horror in mind, is it going to be something very individual, right? Like the better horror for some person is going to provide the better trade-off for that person between, the fear and grotesqueness of it and whatever fascination or other, entertainment that they derive from it. So I was thinking that if so, maybe this might explain, at least in part, why some people like particular horror films and others don't. For example, since the balance, might be favorable for that person, but not for the other. You see what I'm getting at here? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure. No, I was listening, recently, just this week in the last couple of days, Anne Rice died. She's the author of Interview with a Vampire. and so they were playing an interview with her last night, and she said that she thought the greatest horror film ever made was The Bride of Frankenstein. Uh, and, and actually, now, if you had asked me what I thought was the greatest horror film ever made, that would have been my choice. And why is it the greatest? Well, it has certain features uh, that are not in Mary Shelley, but are absolutely fascinating, like the little creatures that Dr. Pretorius creates. The staging, of course, of the creation scenes are spectacular. The kites in the air, they shoot these kites up into the sky to catch the lightning. And of course, another feature of it is this great deal of comedy in it. Ernst Zeithinger, who's playing Dr. Pretorius, is absolutely wild. I mean, he's the one who, proposes a toast to gods and monsters. Then there's the Pierce makeup of the monster, and also of the bride. Uh, you can begin to talk about all of those kind of features in trying to defend it. And I guess what I would want to say is, if you talk to at least fans, it's going to turn out that it's not just Anne Rice and me. Now, it may be it may be the case that not everybody will say, "Oh, yeah, that's it. There's no question here. That is the greatest." But I don't think you're going to run into anybody who seriously says, "You know, it's a turkey." There, in other words, there's not going to be that kind of disagreement. And people do, when they get into arguments in aesthetics. You probably notice this among your friends. Say you're arguing about who's the greater composer, Mozart or Beethoven. Well, you probably notice that sometimes in some conversations, uh, uh, um, the one side will be reduced to the point where they try to make their case by asserting something absolutely absurd. If you're in the Beethoven theme, you go, Mozart stinks. He's horrible. It's a desperate move, but it happens again and again. But it's not something we should take too seriously. I mean, Mozart and Beethoven are both great composers, and I think that people not caught up in the moment of debate will all agree with that. Now, the question of which one is greater might be open to discussion. Uh, um, uh, on the other hand, it might be just silly. When I was a kid, we would get into sort of debates about whether whether what would be a good example. Um, oh, whether Batman would beat was stronger than Iron Man. Well, it didn't make any sense because they didn't inhabit the same universe. There really was no comparison, and no point in comparing them. And it's possible to live in a world where we all can kind of agree that Beethoven and Mozart are good, even though we might disagree about how good we assign them. So that issue of how good may be more subject to personal preference, and that might be where the worry about subjectivity arrives, whereas there's there'll probably be a great deal of convergence, especially among uh, uh, informed audiences about where things stand in terms of a general evaluation of good. Of course, this requires much more discussion than I'm giving now. I've just laid down some of the opening moves. I don't want to think of absolutely closed off discussion here. I've merely tried to open it up.
Yeah, yeah, very good. So I take it like part of the idea is that, broadly speaking, of people that are relatively informed, of relatively similar psychology, they're gonna agree in the sort of simple judgments, but maybe disagree in more precise assessments of how good something is, or relative, um, greatness, and there the subjectivity and difference between people's particular experiences and psychology might make more of a difference. Is that part of the idea there?
Yes, but also I want to also add that the danger in this way of talking is to think that uh, we're dealing with zero-sum games. So that, for example, if you're talking about silent comedians, uh, that it has to be that Chaplin is great and Keaton is not, or Keaton is great and Chaplin is not. Keaton and Chaplin are both good. There's the danger of being lured into the notion that we're talking about the greatest, and thinking that it's a zero-sum game. It's this one that's the greatest, and all the rest are no good.
Right. I think part of what I also had in mind with the question is like, I'll take a film like a horror film like The Exorcist. Most people would, um, I think most people would agree that it's like a great horror film, but a fair amount of people will not enjoy it because it's like too grotesque or too scary for them, and not, doesn't pique their other interests enough. Um, it is that my idea was maybe, yeah, whether someone will enjoy some um, horror film will depend on how these things balance out for them, and what's maybe a lot of people find fascinating in the film like that, others won't find fascinating enough, or to get what I'm saying.
Right, I see what you mean. I want to, in criticism, in terms of criticism, try to actually uh, um, draw a distinction between uh, liking and assessing. As my idea is, look, it's perfectly consistent logically, and it's also consistent psychologically, that you can know something is good, or evaluate or assess something to be good, and it not being, as you might say, your cup of tea. Uh, and similarly, there might be things that you like, uh, um, that you know aren't that good. We have this notion of what we call guilty pleasures, right? Guilty pleasures. What are guilty pleasures? Well, think of the English professor who's an expert in Joyce. Well, maybe she likes to read cheap mystery novels, or true crime stories, for entertaining. This isn't rare. I mean, if I wasn't afraid that I would be sued for libel, I could reel off the names of an awful lot of academics who have closets full of very lowbrow novels, and we all know this. I know a distinguished philosopher, and late, he's dead now, but he was a great expert on existentialism, but he loved the Three Stooges. And so there's nothing strange about um, uh, liking something, but admitting, well, it's not the greatest piece of work. But also, there's no problem in the other direction, logically or psychologically, with acknowledging something that's very good, but I don't like it. There are quite a lot of people who will tell you that Wagner's is great, but I, I, it's not Wagner's not for me. There's no problem, I think there. It's true that very much the case that sort of in the 18th century, when a lot of the foundations of modern aesthetics were set, there was an association drawn between pleasure and uh, um, and evaluations of goodness. Well, you could even hear it in what it was involved in evaluation in those days. The British called it taste. Good taste was taking pleasure in the right things, and it was a very non-cognitive model. Appreciating a work uh, was like appreciating a good meal.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And yeah, I find myself, like, for example, I'm not really a fan of opera, but I can recognize that there are a lot of great works, right, in opera works. I think, and this has to do with the distinction you've drawn between appreciation as liking versus appreciation as sizing up. Is that sort of the same thing?
Yes, it is. It is. I mean, the word appreciation has a couple of different meanings. One, if I say to my neighbor, I really appreciate what you've done with your yard. I really appreciate what you've done with your garden. Then I'm probably saying something like I like it. On the other hand, when a chess master offers an appreciation of a chess game, perhaps the chess game that he's just lost, he's telling you how a certain move is inevitably led to a checkmate. Maybe even a checkmate that he's very sorry he suffered. In the military, appreciation is used in the same way. A general gives an appreciation of the battle. That doesn't mean he's telling you that he liked the outcome of the battle. He's just telling you how, in virtue of certain moves, this flanking maneuver that caused the defeat of one side was successfully engineered. And similarly, I want to say, well, what to appreciate a work is to see how the various purposes that the work was aimed to bring about were achieved or not achieved. Um, uh, why the work failed. That's what it means to size up the work. And in terms of what I was saying before, you can size up something, and it may not be something that actually you enjoy. That's how I think of criticism. Although it's true that in our society for a long time, what some people at least think critics should be are consumer report people, and they should be telling you whether or not you'll enjoy this movie or not. And people will advise you to find out critics who enjoy the same things you enjoy, because they'll be able to send you to a good night at the movies.
Yeah, yeah, and so I just had a worry that came to mind is that like um, we don't want these things to come apart too much, right? What if it turned out that like pretty much everyone didn't like some uh, artwork, but via some objective metric, it was, you know, um, it was great or something like that.
Well, it's not so odd, but the first thing is, uh, uh, the first thing you want to notice is what I'm claiming is maybe weaker than it sounds. After all, what I'm claiming is that the relationship between liking and assessing is contingent. It's not necessary. That's the key move that I'm making. Now, you say, well, surely if nobody likes the work, or the vast majority don't like the work, there is got to be some kind of relationship there. But notice how often we decide that the work that came out and was really not thought of very highly. Subsequently, we think actually was a masterpiece. I just was just writing a piece for a newspaper, the New Statements. I was writing a piece about Hitchcock's Vertigo, which in 2012, the magazine Sight and Sound declared to be the greatest film ever made. Knocking Citizen Kane off its perch. That had been the position held by Citizen Kane for the last 50 years. And, when you look back, Vertigo in Britain was mostly badly reviewed. And compared to Hitchcock's other films, it only just broke even. I mean, Hitchcock was an incredibly successful director. He was one of the few directors who had what in the old days called his name above the title. In other words, it was Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Vertigo was a real economic disappointment. And it did a little better critically in the United States. The critics split, but most of the critics in Britain didn't like it. The New Yorker reviewed it, said, this no one can understand this plot. And now, this it's considered one of the greatest films ever made. And this isn't unusual, right? Very often you learn that a novel that we think of as an absolutely major novel, or a poem or a piece of music was reviled when it came out. Rite of Spring, for example, supposedly caused a riot in the theater when it was in the concert hall when it was first performed. Um, of course, sometimes we have to worry that these supposed riots that were happening were maybe kind of staged to advertise the play or the piece of music so that it became a success du scandale. But nevertheless, it's not unusual to hear that something was, if not universally, just widely despised, that we now look back and say, oh, well, no, it was great. They were wrong. So you have to be careful about how much weight you want to place on what seems to be an apparent consensus, at least for some of the time. So that's one kind of way of responding to you. The other is to kind of say, notice my claim is not so strong as you might fear. After all, I'm just saying that the relationship between sizing up positively and enjoying is contingent. Not to say that I happen to have the high opinion that you have, or that you said that many have of The Exorcist, both the novel and the film, and I like it too. I'm not saying that there's never any relationship. I'm just saying the opposite, that there isn't always that relationship. Again, it's like kind of moderate moralism. It may be, a less fire-breathing position than it sounds when it comes out the gate.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, at the very least, there's going to be this, you know, typical correlation, even if weak sometimes, between how great some work of art is by the metrics we might have in mind and how much we like it, because we tend to like great works of art, at least generally speaking.
Well,
But it doesn't have to always line up, right?
right. Well, I claim that uh, Bride of Frankenstein is a great film, and I like it.
Yeah,
But
fair
there,
enough. And, yeah.
yeah, no, go on.
No, no, no. I did want to ask, because you mentioned Bride of Frankenstein and some other films, and just more lighthearted question. What are some films that you would consider to be, examples of great film?
Well, because I've done work in film, and I was a film critic for a while. People at parties will ask me, "What's the greatest film that ever was made?" And a lot of people in my position go, "Oh, we can't really say what the greatest film ever made was. There are so many great ones. It's such a complicated question." Blah blah blah. I always answer the question. I always say I think the greatest film that was ever made was Rules of the Game by Renoir. I think that for purposes of conversation, especially at cocktail parties, it's better to answer and say something like that, and then say people say, well, why do you say that? And I'll give the reasons why I think it is, and I think we'll have a much better conversation. So the person I'm talking to might say, well, something else is the greatest film ever made, and I'll say why, and they'll give me reasons. I may learn something, they may learn something. We'll have an interesting conversation instead of this kind of refusing to have the conversation, saying, "Oh, it's way too, it's way too complicated. I have too many ideas, etc." Now, I do think that Rules of the Game is a great film, and I do think it's defensible in that position. In fact, that Sight and Sound um, uh, declaration of Vertigo as the greatest film in the world. That's based on the responses of, I think, several hundred critics. And to tell you the truth, I was one of the critics who voted in that, and I voted for Rules of the Game. I wasn't upset that Vertigo won. Full disclosure, Vertigo is number 5 on my list. uh, uh, so going back to our previous conversation, though I was in favor of Rules of the Game, I didn't say, "Oh, Vertigo, it's terrible." I just didn't think it was quite as good. Reasons I think that Rules of the Game is great have a lot to do with its the way its cinematography. Specifically, its use of long take, deep focus shots serves the dramatic and thematic purposes of the film.
Yeah, I'm not really familiar. I'll have to check that out. Sounds
Well,
good.
dude, try and see it, and then try and see it in a theater if you can. It's quite a spectacular feat of cinema. And you can almost always rely on Renoir films. Maybe the 30s is a great period, but if you've seen films like Grand Illusion, he's really a great filmmaker.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a bit harder to see a lot of movies in theaters these days, but um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, and also people don't always see films on the devices they were made, the platforms they were made to be seen on. So rules of the game should be seen in a 35 millimeter print version. Uh, I don't know where you live. If you live in New York, you can see it at Anthology Film Archives. They'll show it the right way.
fair
Or
enough.
if you live in Paris, you can see it at the Cinematheque.
I'm up in Canada, so um, maybe there's a theater around here that plays older things. But anyway, I did have another question about art appreciation, um, and so a lot of art has like religious or political or cultural significance, and or other things like that, and that often plays an important role in maybe even a constitutive role in what that thing is as a work of art. And I was wondering, like, given this, if we don't share the relevant commitments or belong to the relevant culture, or are otherwise not very sensitive to those features, are we going to tend to miss out on some of the important aspects of that work of art? And so our appreciation of it will suffer accordingly. Is this a serious concern? And if so, how might we mitigate it? If you could
Well,
elaborate.
one thing that we are interested in it as a work of art is in, let's call it its artistry. And what is its artistry involved with? Well, let's say the way that it's been put together, the way that it's been designed, and how that uh, serves the purposes of the work. You think of a Gothic cathedral, and think of what its purposes are, and then think of how the way in which the vault of the Gothic cathedral is designed to draw your eyes upwards towards heaven. Um, that's part of its, let's call it, its rhetorical purpose. And the the vertical pull of a Gothic cathedral is part of, it serves part of the rhetorical purpose of the building, which is to make you look heavenwards. That's a very simple example. But to think of other architectural designs, think of Greek temples. If you recall, Greek temples involve lots of columns, and some temples are devoted to what you might think of as floral gods. Those tend to have those columns that are called Corinthian columns, where the top is highly decorated. Other gods are martial gods like Ares or Mars, and those are much more. The columns are much more austere. They're Doric or the Doric columns. So you don't have to believe that there is such a god as Mars, but you can appreciate the artistic choice of that kind of austere column for a temple of a warrior god, right? So I mean, you can see how the artistic choices reinforce the meaning in this case of the temple. So even if we begin to talk about faiths that maybe people still do believe Christianity, we can see still how the design choices suit the purpose of the religion without being a believer in the religion. So a Quaker church, in the way it doesn't have it doesn't have a kind of setup where there's a preacher in front who's leading them, but is designed so that everyone is looking at each other equally. The very choice of the way that it's put together, its artistry, reinforces its message and its purpose. And so you can look at Renaissance paintings and not be a believer in the Catholic faith, and yet appreciate the way in which the purposes of the Catholic faith, the message of the Catholic faith, is being communicated to you uh, by that uh, uh, painterly composition.
Right. Yeah, I think I get your point, right? So it's it doesn't need to make a difference with respect to appreciation as sizing up, because you can sort of talk about these attributes and how well it does what it was intended to do without having to share the commitments or belong to the culture. But it still could make a difference with respect to appreciation as liking, right? I mean, someone might, um, when seeing some religious artwork, have some emotional response, positive emotional response that someone who doesn't share those commitments might not have, and that might lead them to like it more and so on. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah. No. I mean, what I was just talking about, and what I was kind of stressing when I talked about sizing up, was uh, uh, considering it from uh, 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 the artistic viewpoint. It might be the case that from a moral viewpoint, uh, uh, you think that the work has demerits. Well, uh, at a certain point, it may be the case that you have to make an all things considered judgment, and you'll find that you might feel that the artwork was very well put together in terms of the way it realized its purpose, but you think the purpose itself is questionable. You might think it's questionable for a number of reasons. You might think that, well, the purpose really didn't merit the amount of effort that was put in to it, uh, uh, or you might think the purpose was wrong, and then you have to make what's called an all things considered judgment. And that's a judgment that in this case may be very difficult to make, because it may get a plus for its artistic, its artistry and its craft, in the way that it serves its purpose, but then its purpose may seem to be uh, 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 not that desirable, and so the work will get a mixed verdict. And that may happen often, but you shouldn't be surprised, I think, because what most artworks probably deserve are mixed verdicts. Um, Partly they are mixed verdicts because very often when an artist makes some choices, um, that will be that will just preclude making other choices. Uh, so we shouldn't be disappointed if we find out that at the end of the day, well, that a lot of artworks are not so good, and that even the good ones call forth a mixed verdict.
Yeah, that seems right. And I did want to move on and talk about aesthetic experience. If that's all right. Uh,
Sure.
but just so regarding aesthetic experience, you've argued that an experience counts as an aesthetic experience insofar as it involves attending with understanding to the formal and or aesthetic and or expressive properties of a work of art. Um, could you talk a bit uh, about this account? In particular, what does like understanding mean here? Is it that you're attending to the certain attributes with the recognition of them as
You
those sorts of
right
attributes,
up.
or
So you were asking about understanding. One
yeah,
thing I want to say about that is that almost all versions of aesthetic experience require understanding. Um, uh, and what's meant by understanding? Well, you have to kind of know what the work is and what it's about. So you wouldn't really be having an aesthetic experience, say, of let's say, an anti-war novel like All Quiet on the Western Front. If what you if your experience of it was that you really liked the battle scenes and but you thought that the book was pro-war. I mean, you have to know what you're looking at. That and almost everybody wants to add that requirement for aesthetic experience. Um, well, just so that it won't be because that your positive experience won't be a result of the fact that it's based on a misunderstanding.
right. Um, or like you can just happen to have some emotional response, just because you've glanced at some work of art, but aren't really considering it as a work of art or as the work of art that it is. Uh,
Or here's an example. Suppose you're a train aficionado, and you have a very positive experience of Buster Keaton's film The General because it's got a lot of trains in it, right? So it isn't the narrative structure, it isn't the composition, it isn't the editing. Then that's not what you're focused on. You're just happy because there are these old time trains in it. You're not appreciating the work with understanding. So
yeah,
I mean, I think most people think that the understanding requirement is kind of innocuous, uh, and it just requires the most broad kind of a understanding. Um, that if you want to say, you know what you're looking at.
right. Fair enough. And so I did have a few brief criticisms of your account, and I was looking to get your thoughts on those, if that's all right. Um,
Sure, shoot
yeah.
away.
So first, I was wondering if this account might make aesthetic experiences overly cognitive. Like, so maybe there are some emotional responses to artworks that we might have that we might consider aesthetic experiences that I mean either don't have or minimally have this sort of cognitive component required on your account. So um, like on Jesse Prince's approach, although it might fail in certain ways, if we're interpreting it as an account of aesthetic experience. Perhaps some aesthetic experiences are sort of exhausted by some emotional response of wonder or something like that to some artwork. What do you think about this response?
Well, I do think I don't think that. Okay, well, look, I don't deny that emotional responses could be uh, um, germane to aesthetic experience. Uh, among other things, emotions responses might be required in order to see whether the work has been designed in order to successfully elicit the emotional responses it's aimed at. But in that case, I would think that the emotional responses as what we would call a subroutine um, uh, testing to see whether or not the work has been designed to secure its purpose. So I think that it's a mistake to think that uh, that emotional responses have nothing to do with having aesthetic experiences. Partly the issue, as I understand it, uh, is the aesthetic experience essentially a matter of an emotional response, and that's what I'm denying. I mean, I think in the end, it is much more a matter of understanding in a rich sense, and part of our understanding in a rich sense will require deploying our emotional responses. I mean, as for the notion that the aesthetic experience is definable as a specific emotional response like awe or wonder, and that's something I would deny. Why? Well, among other things, I think despite the way people talk, I think that we have lots of negative aesthetic experiences. In fact, um, I can go to the galleries and look at new work of art for weeks on end, and only have negative aesthetic experiences. Uh, uh, um, it seems to me that the tendency to uh, identify uh, uh, aesthetic experiences to core or all aesthetic experiences positively in terms of a concept like awe uh, um, um, makes no accommodation for the fact that so many aesthetic experiences can be negative experiences. I also think that the notion of awe as the experience, the nature of the experience is wrong because look, it would preclude certain aesthetic experiences, or involves taking your breath in, going, that's what awe is. But then there are all kinds of artworks engendering aesthetic responses that are expulsive. Laughter throws something out. Horror, horror also is expulsive, insofar as, if I'm right, it involves disgust. Disgust involves throwing things out. So I don't think that uh, uh, either awe or wonder are going to do the job if they are the emotions being proposed, because they're too exclusive. They'll exclude negative aesthetic experiences. When I examine the work and I see the design doesn't serve its purposes, and also there are specific emotional responses that works of art aim at that don't suit the phenomenology of, of wonder and awe. Uh, of course, I can easily accommodate emotions in my model, since it is the purpose of many works of art to elicit emotions, so that determining, using myself and my own emotional repertoire to test whether or not the work elicits the uh, 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 emotion that it's designed to, means that the emotions will very often, maybe even most often, be involved in one way or another, experiencing the work aesthetically.
Yeah, a lot of good points there. I did just want to bring up the second criticism and get through these, and maybe I'll offer some follow-ups as well. But so um, we might also think that there are some experiences which your account would count as aesthetic experiences, which maybe shouldn't be counted. So, for example, consider someone attending completely dispassionately to some formal property of an artwork. Perhaps they go up to it with some measuring device and try to determine its symmetry, and maybe they recognize that, and um, or something else like that. But arguably this person isn't really having an aesthetic experience, but it seems that by your account they would be. What do you think about this response?
Well, I'm not sure about the example. I mean, if the person is just taking measurements to describe the work. I don't know, maybe he works or she works for Christie's or Sotheby's, and they need an exact description. I would agree that's not an aesthetic experience, but there he's not attending to the formal features of the work, at least in the way that I understand attending to the formal features. For me, the formal features of the work are the assembly of choices that artists make in order to um, identify the essential or constitutive purposes of the work, right? So having an aesthetic experience is in engaging with the form of the work to really see, for example, how the parts, the choices that the artists have made serve the constitutive purposes of the work. Now, just taking the measurements of things isn't doing that. But maybe you have more in mind, and I'm interpreting your example too minimally.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, what if the person is just um, okay? They're not just taking measurements, but they're just maybe maybe they remark on how um, oh, the artist effectively produced an artwork which satisfies this purpose or something,
Well,
or exhibits great skill. Yeah.
here's an example. In the beginning of Triumph of the Will, I don't know if you remember the beginning of Triumph of the Will. Uh, I could make a remark like this. I mean, the beginning of Triumph of the Will, there's a plane. It's flying through the crowds. It casts a shadow on Nuremberg below the city, and it looks like people are kind of trying to follow the plane. The plane then comes out of the sky, lands, and who comes out of the plane? Hitler, right? And so you look at it and you talk about how the design of this scene satisfies the purpose of the work, which is, among other things, to exalt Hitler. Well, and you point out, like, well, he's coming out of the clouds, he's descending, he's like a god, right? It's like a god, and people are following the shadow of his plane as if he's this god who's flying through the air, and so you notice all of that, and you say, and that's the purpose it serves. I would say that that's an aesthetic experience. What is it? What does it lack? Uh, I'm not sure what it lacks. I mean, I call my view of aesthetic experience deflationary. Another word I use for it is I call it a content approach. That what I mean by a content approach is to try and say what the experience is in terms of its content, right? So what's a sexual experience? Well, it's the content that determines what it is. Uh, we don't usually talk about it, but what would be an ice cream experience? It would be the ice cream. I mean, and you know, it's not so bizarre in a number of experiences, especially in terms of things we taste or we smell. Uh, how do we name those experiences? We say what the content of them were, what the content of the experience is. Um, so, uh, so my view is a content experience, and it's deflationary. Why? Well, because it doesn't require maybe what in the back of your mind you were trying to bring to the discussion. A lot of people would say, look, an aesthetic experience is an experience that we value for its own sake. Uh, that is to say, it's also an experience of valuing. And to go back to my previous discussion, I don't think that that's exactly right, because of the tradition has it that it's an experience of positive valuing. And as I said before, I think a lot of our experiences of art, a lot of our experience, our aesthetic experiences are negative. So I am deflationary inside in the sense that I've taken out of the account a positive evaluation and said, let's just do it in terms of its content.
Right, and there's also like the more or less neutral responses too, which we might have on occasion.
Right. Very often we're indifferent. I don't know about you, but very often my experience of a visit to a gallery is indifference.
Right. No, I agree with that. So I did want to move on to the third thing I had, which was that, okay, so suppose that your account correctly divides aesthetic experiences and non-aesthetic experiences. Doesn't seem really equipped for finer distinctions between aesthetic experiences. So for example, we might want to say that one aesthetic experience is much stronger, more powerful in some sense than another, but it's not clear how we can account for this by talking about degrees of understanding or attentiveness to the formal aesthetic or expressive properties. Maybe someone might want to say that what's at play here is some degree of emotional response, maybe, but do you see what I'm getting at here?
Um, so I guess to say, well, I'm not.
So I could give an example.
Oh, go ahead. Give me an example.
Well, I mean, someone sees some someone sees some very large, beautiful painting, for example, and that can lead to a very sort of powerful aesthetic experience, right? They can not just be like with understanding and tending to these certain details and so forth, but also um, uh, have some strong emotional response, and that could seem to be part of the experience that they're having in a way. Whereas in some other artwork, um, maybe it's just as good in terms of those attributes, and they're attending to them just as well with this equal understanding, but it doesn't sort of lead to the same emotional response or the same emotional response to that degree. If you get what I'm saying. And presumably we want to say that one of the first experience is in a way stronger or more powerful than the second one as an aesthetic experience. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess I would go back to what I said earlier. So you have a very powerful experience to something. Let's say it's a building, and you're struck. Your jaw drops when you see it, because it's uh, uh, so powerful, uh, right? Um, well, I don't deny that. I mean, a, a, a prairie home, a kind of right Usonian prairie home, uh, uh, very modest, is not going to elicit the same emotional responses standing in the middle of the piazza in front of St. Peter's Cathedral. That's certainly true. And as I said earlier, I don't deny that our emotions are going to come into play. But one thing that's important about grand buildings is that they have a function, they have a purpose. Their grandness is to reflect the grandness of what they're in the business of, whatever that might be. Uh, uh, I don't deny that there's a powerful emotional response in many works of art, and in some other works of art it actually maybe the very point of the work that it's actually suppressing how strong the response is supposed to be. So all that's true, but you wouldn't want to say, in virtue of the let's say the intensity of the emotional response, that makes the aesthetic experience a better or a different. Well, it makes it a different aesthetic experience, but it might be just as good. The the lack of aggressiveness of a work, its restraint, might be what makes that a good work, whereas its intensity in another case is what makes that a good work. Uh, uh, for an example of restraint, if you've ever seen the films of Bresson, the films are very restrained, and they're designed that way. And given the kind of view that he has of faith, that's appropriate to those. That's a good choice. In other cases, the look of the fortress, the powerful look of the fortress, projects power, and that subserves its purpose. Um, so I don't think that you want to mix emotional intensity or lack of emotional intensity. I don't think you want to connect that to claims about the which aesthetic experience is the I don't know, the better aesthetic experience. Uh, Now, it might be that, look, it's not the emotions that you want. You just think that there's a way of talking about magnitudes of aesthetic experience. So some aesthetic experiences are better than other aesthetic experiences along some kind of measurement. And sometimes certain features are uh, um, invoked, like unity or diversity or intensity, or the way that those are combined. Um, well, if it's a matter of content, things like that, then if you can come up with them, then I suppose I'll try and appropriate them. But I think the ball is in your side of the park. It's in your domain to meet the burden of how we're going to assess the magnitude of aesthetic experiences. Um, Again, my tendency is to say, well, let's just be satisfied with uh, uh, talking about what the aesthetic experience is and what the dimensions are that constitute it, as opposed to then getting into the business of saying which are the better ones and which are the lesser ones.
Right, right. Okay, fair enough. So it's part of the idea there that aesthetic experiences might, at least in some cases, contingently involve some emotional response, and those can, those can vary in intensity. But that's not really sort of constitutive of the aesthetic experience, like, as
Right.
an
So
aesthetic experience. Yeah.
right. So there are a lot of works of conceptual art that are actually meant to uh, be less addressed to the emotions and more addressed to thinking of various kind of artistic problems or meta artistic issues, you know, there are German expressionist paintings on the one hand, but then there are Duchamp's ready-mades on the other hand, and they are aimed at different things, and it's not clear that um, uh, without further explanation that one is a better aesthetic experience than the other, or at least I would like to hear more about what the criteria would be for determining which was the better aesthetic experience. I mean, there are things that
Right.
we can talk about certain works being more complicated than others, certain works being more sophisticated than others. Uh, but then we're talking about the complexity and sophistication of the work, not of the experience.
Right. Yeah, that's a fair point. And the final issue I had is a very much a more general one. So if it's a serious problem, then it's kind of be a serious problem for all of these accounts. It seems to me that the experiences we tend to call aesthetic experiences, they're so wide and varied, and the difference between these experiences and others are often vague and minute, such as it's not clear that we should expect there to be some relatively simple account, in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions for what it is to be in an aesthetic experience. Um, that, is this a worry you think is worth taking seriously? Like, maybe we shouldn't even expect some straightforward account of what an aesthetic experience is.
Well, I guess I have a couple of things to say about it. I don't know if they all add up to a unified package. One is um, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, there is some controversy about it, but I think most people agree. Look, there are aesthetic properties of the work, and there are other properties that are key to the work, but are not necessarily aesthetic. Um, we've talked about some of them, moral and cognitive properties. So some people say, look, works can have artistic properties and they can have aesthetic properties. Aesthetic properties are one kind of artistic property, right? The aesthetic properties are according to me, they're the formal, expressive, and otherwise aesthetic properties of the work. Um, uh, they're qualitative properties, in other words. Um, um, and works have form. They can have expressive properties. They can have these qualitative properties. They can be elegant. They can be forceful. They can have properties like that. They also can have properties like being moral or immoral. So I think all these properties are artistic properties, but one group of them are the aesthetic properties. And the aesthetic properties, for example, the formal properties are the how properties of the work. And so I think it's useful to have these labels for different kinds of properties that make for different kinds of experiences. And as for the fact that there's a wide diversity of things that we might call aesthetic properties or formal properties or expressive properties. Well, yeah, there are indeterminately large number of configurations that might be involved here, but um, there are an indeterminately large number of forms a work of art can take. There are an indeterminately large number of moods and emotions and feelings that a work can express. Um, but the fact that we want to have this one domain, I don't think is a problem. It actually enhances our ability to describe and explain works of art by having categories exactly like this. Um, and also, there's the historical matter, which is that since the 18th century, people have been talking about aesthetic experiences. So we would like to know what they are. So that's another reason for wanting to set down conditions for what aesthetic experiences are. And lastly, uh, uh, it's important, and I think this is an issue that you're really interested in. It is really important for us to clarify what we mean by aesthetic experiences, because this then fits into other kinds of discussions. So we were talking earlier about the people who say that moderate autonomism is true. They say that a moral defect is never an aesthetic defect. Uh, uh, and the moderate moralist wants to say it is. Well, in order to be able to get our minds around that debate, we have to know what an aesthetic effect is. And that brings up the whole issue of why it is that we do philosophy of art. Um, why do we focus on issues like saying what aesthetic experience is? It's because it is an endeavor to articulate clearly the kinds of concepts that we use about or are using in our discussions, our commerce with art at all times. I mean, that's why philosophers of art ask, questions like, "What is art?" Um, because if in a very mundane sense, that will figure in debates that we have about work. Somebody will say, "That's not art. My kid could do that." We want to know what we mean by art. Or somebody says, "Well, morality is completely irrelevant when it comes to talk about art, because why? Art is about aesthetic experience. So we've got to know what aesthetic experience is." And this extends in every direction. Philosophers of literature want to know what fiction is, because some people will say things like, "Well, you know, some of these things that people write, they're not fiction at all. They're nonfiction." I mean, the question arises about what's the distinction between fiction and nonfiction. So the work of a philosopher of art, like the work of philosophers in general, is to scrutinize and try to get into shape the concepts that we need to carry forward the practices of art we're engaged in, whether we're artists or critics or just art lovers.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good outlook on it. So before we wrap up, I did want to ask a couple questions about the philosophy of humor. And you wrote, as I mentioned at the outset, the humor, a very short introduction book in which you at least briefly explore the nature of humor, its relation to emotion, cognition, and value. And you consider some of the common theories, such as the superiority theory, incongruity, release, play, dispositional theory, and perhaps others I can recall. And while each of these have their benefits, they each have various shortcomings. Um, but in a similar way, I'm somewhat inclined to think that humor is this really incredibly vague concept built up not particularly systematically from a wide variety of cases, and as such is unlikely to be adequately captured by some relatively simple theory like these. And so, I mean, like personally looking at it, I think these approaches might be just doomed from the outset. um, do you have a preferred account of what humor is, and what do you make? I mean, I guess it's sort of a similar thing, but what do you make of my methodological concern here?
Well, first of all, the concept of humor I have is pretty complicated since it's got at least 6 conditions. I don't think we have time to go through all of those. But um, your worry is that there. Well, I guess in part your worry is that you can't have a simple definition, like some of the classical ones. Well, I guess I agree with that. But I think the fact that you can't have a simple theory doesn't mean that you can't have a theory. Now, in terms of my own view, I offer a theory in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. That's true. But I nevertheless think of my proposal as a heuristic. It's useful for isolating different features in what makes this or that example humorous. Um, and by heuristic, I mean that it's a way in general of exploring the territory, of telling you where to look, and also the advantage of this approach, the approach in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions, I think is defensible, because there's no more powerful way to discover the conceptual shape of anything, any topic like art or humor that you're examining than the method of necessary and sufficient condition. It's an exploratory device. Very often, maybe even most often, the analyses people offer of necessary and sufficient conditions fail. However, you learn so much by proposing one. You not only may be surprised as to how one of the conditions picks out something that you never thought was relevant, but also when people respond to them, as they often do, by providing counterexamples or pointing to other kinds of considerations, or pointing to some absurd consequence of your theory, that suddenly you've made something that doesn't seem to belong to the concept to be something that falls under it. You learn what I'm saying, or what I'm calling the shape of the territory. You discover things about your concept that maybe you hadn't noticed before. So I think of the method of necessary and sufficient conditions as an exploratory device, as an instrument that uh, you learn by trying to do it. Sometimes people say they raise the kind of methodological worry that you have, that oh, you'll never find out these things because the phenomena is too complex, and so you shouldn't try. I don't think that you shouldn't try. I think that's the wrong conclusion to come to. I think the conclusion is you should try because you'll learn something by trying, even if it fails. And that I think is far more productive than saying ahead of time, throwing up your hands and saying, oh, it's so complex, we shouldn't even bother to try and do it. So I'm a staunch believer in trying to forge ahead and find necessary and sufficient conditions, even if that means um, at the end of the day, my theory is going to be defeated. Because I think even if the theory is defeated, we may have made some progress. And we might have made even some progress to getting a better set of necessary and sufficient conditions. Um, or we might learn how we need to make provisions for something we hadn't thought of before, and suddenly see a new dimension to the practice in front of us.
Yeah, those are very fair points. Yeah, so just to wrap up, and this is something you've already, I think, commented on briefly here, but what are some of the benefits of the philosophy of aesthetics? In other words, why engage in this sort of theorizing?
Well, as I think I said before, all of our practices in general depend on concepts, right? I mean, our commercial practices depend on concepts like money, exchange, and even then more specific concepts, compound interest, etc. Sports have all kinds of we require all kinds of concepts. Baseball requires strikes, fouls, etc. Everything we do involves concepts and categories, and it's essential that we have some grasp of those concepts and categories, and that's the job that's one of the major jobs of philosophy, is to examine our concepts. That was what Socrates was interested. He went into the public sphere to ask questions like, what is justice? What is knowledge? What is virtue? Those are central concepts to civilized life. Well, philosophers of art are also interested in looking at the concepts that make our various practices possible, by making those concepts more and more intelligible. And as I said, obvious ones are things like what's art? What's an artwork? The one we've been talking about, aesthetic experience. The Obviously, numerous forms of art involve humor. So, what is humor? Uh, what philosophers of art do is clarify and enrich our repertoire of concepts that make our conversation about art and of art intelligible. The concepts that are shared by artists, audiences, critics and lovers of art.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So I think with that, I'll end the questions there, and thank you again for and coming on and taking all my questions on the topics, and it's been really great having you.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I've had a lot of fun, and I really appreciate the attention that you've given me, and the sometimes tough questions that you asked me.